And now on to the main event. Joining us tonight is author Paul Vidich. He's the author of a number of fast-paced thrillers, including An Honorable Man and The Coldest Warrior. His latest spy novel drops us in Cold War Moscow as the Soviet Union begins its decline. The novel follows CIA officer Alex Garin and his attempt to infiltrate the KGB. But as a former KGB officer himself, can Garin really be trusted? In addition to writing page turners, his fiction and nonfiction writing have appeared in high-profile pubs as the Wall Street Journal and LitHub, among others. And Paul is a Wesleyan University alum and Wesleyan parent twice over. In conversation with Paul tonight is Stephen Schiff, an award-winning screenwriter, TV writer, producer, and journalist. He's also a fellow Wesleyan alum. Paul and Stephen are both members of the Cardinal Class of '72. I will now bow out and let the reunion commence. Paul, Stephen, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be doing this with Paul. We've done things like this before for his previous novels, and I've followed his career very happily as he became a first-rate spy novel writer. I actually want to ask just briefly. I know you've told the story a million times, Paul, but you were a high-level entertainment executive for decade upon decade, and then you turned your attention to this completely other form. Although I suppose we could argue that there are similarities between being a high-level entertainment executive and being a completely duplicitous spy. But I think it'd be interesting to hear how you turned your attention that way. Were you, for instance, always enamored of the spy novel? Were you a constant reader, or did it come to you lately? I know you have a family connection to the genre too, that maybe you want to speak about.
I was an executive, but before I was an executive, I was an aspiring writer. And then a child came along. It was pretty clear to me that you couldn't make money writing novels. At least I didn't have the confidence I would be able to pull that off. So I launched into a business career, got an MBA, and never lost my interest in writing, and did it on the side, and made a bargain with myself that when I was financially able, I would give up my career, which surprised a number of people when I did, and go off to writing. And it sort of felt like jumping off a cliff without a parachute, because there are a lot of people who looked at me, and I did this when I was 55, 56, who said, "You are out of your mind. Why would you do that? Giving up a couple $1 million a year in income for poverty." And but writing is one of those things that I think is a calling. Something that you have in you that if you don't do it at some point in your life, you're going to regret. And I sort of said, I don't want to regret this. And it so happened that there was a personal connection with the CIA, but it had, and that uncle of mine, Frank Olson, who I think a number of you who read The Coldest Warrior are familiar with that story. But in any case, that provided the story that allowed me to get into the spy novel as the genre I chose to write in. So the first question was, why write? And the second was, okay, you're going to write, so what do you write about? And it so happened that you and I very serendipitously found ourselves writing about Russians in the 80s, about the same time, actually. So I should ask you, how did you get to the Russians? What was your origin story?
For those of you who don't know, I was a writer and executive producer at the TV show The Americans, which ran on FX for 6 seasons. And what you may not know, Paul, is that I had come to something like this years before, when I was writing a movie that functioned as a prequel to The Americans, but before The Americans was even a glimmer in anyone's eye. And I'm back working on that because Universal now wants to turn it into a movie, and that's called The Charm School. It came from a Nelson DeMille novel, and it was about a sort of CIA guys and other American intelligence guys in Moscow during the early 80s. Your book said in 85, my thing was said in 82, and they discover a training camp that's devoted to making Russians into illegals, meaning spies who are planted on American soil and are passing for Americans, just like the characters in The Americans. But I wrote this in 2006, and The Americans wasn't on the air until 2013. So I came to that a while ago, and I for some reason, I mean, I do have grandparents who came from Ukraine and Belarus and other, and maybe from one from Russia itself. But I hadn't felt a strong connection with Russia. But man, that's where the spy stuff is. And when you start, and the great kind of red hot center of spy fiction in the 20th century, which is when spy fiction really emerged as an important genre, is of course the conflict between the Soviet Union and the US. And if you become interested in spy fiction and you begin to see it, as I did, as a huge way, a way of talking about everything in life, because we all are in a way spies in our own lives, and we all find ourselves torn between our various small deceptions, or maybe even large deceptions for some people, and the need to create real relationships and speak truth to those who are close to us, and speak truth for our own sakes. And the conflict that is present in, I think, everybody's life for that reason is mirrored in such interesting ways in spy fiction, that sort of meta feeling about spy fiction is one of the things that drew me. How about you?
Well, yeah, I was drawn to it through this story about my uncle, but once you begin to write in the genre, you do discover that spies are interesting because they lie for a living. And we all lie in our lives in various ways, and certainly in corporate America, a lot of what you do is how you arm twist and sort of deceive and suborn people for a goal, and not with any sense of malice, but that's what it takes to get things done. But the spy does this sort of legitimately. They're sort of sanctioned criminals in a way. And there's a part of us, I think, when we read fiction, that like to be vicariously taken to a world that we don't ourselves live in, but you can participate in it through the characters of a novel. And I think one of the things that I like about spy fiction is that it is genre. I think the best writers in the genre, like Le Carré, Cannon, McCary, and others, I would also say are literary writers. But the thing that allows you sort of some freedom in spy fiction in the genre are the constraints of the genre. And I think I think you and I once talked about this, that constraints are freeing, sort of the guardrails of the work, and then you can explore all sorts of things within it. And that was, I think that's one of the things that I found attractive to writing spy fiction.
Yeah, I've often compared it to the blues. The blues is essentially 3 chords, but it's amazing the expanse you can cover with those 3 chords and variations on them. One thing you just said that maybe you could expand on is the idea of the literary spy fiction maker, literary spy fiction. What makes you make that distinction?
Well, I think the biggest distinction is the way that the writer uses language. People remember books for the story, but they go back to a book for the language. and a really well-written work, one by Joseph Cannon or Le Carré or Graham Greene, are books where you can savor the language and you can see the sophistication of the language in the way that the story is being told. And I think that's what makes it literary. And you can enjoy a book that's not literary, and they usually sell a lot more than a literary work. But I think the books you go back to that become part of what's called a canon or the canon are books that are really well written. And I think that, Le Carré, who you met once and interviewed, is somebody who was originally sort of dismissed as a genre writer. But his book, his third book, The Spy Who Came Hidden from the Cold, was an international bestseller when it was released in 1963. And then he went on to write what I think are remarkable works, which taken together, the Smiley novels, really speak to life in England in the second half of the 20th century. And he captured the things about a social class, the betrayals, the sexual betrayals, the political betrayals, in a way that made it much larger than just a spy story. It was a love story, stories about integrity. And I think he's read for that now, as well as being read for the remarkable, spy stories he tells. And I think that, it's that to me is the way in which he found the freedom of genre to give him this larger palette with which to work. And I think it's not unlike other writers. Faulkner had the Mississippi, backwater. Joseph Conrad had the sea. Rudyard Kipling had India. And every writer of stature finds a place in which to explore themes and characters that are interesting to them. And for me, spies, and for you, spies are really this unique thing that we've only really had professionally since 1948. When the CIA was created. Although there were British spies between the war, they were sort of gentlemen spies. But the idea of a professional class for spies really only emerged in the Cold War. And so it's not, it's easy to understand how out of that golden age of spying would come the golden age of the spy novel, which is, what I think you've seen in the last 40 years. What's interesting here, just as a bit of an aside, is that the spy novel was really for many years only an English novel. Eric Ambler, Rudyard Kipling, Joseph Conrad, and then after him, Ian Fleming, Graham Greene, Le Carré, all English. And the first American spy novel, I think, was really Born Identity, which came out in 1980. And before then, unless anybody on this call, and they're all, I see all of you, you're wonderful readers. You may be able to correct me on this point, but I do think the American spy novel really took a lot longer to emerge because the American spy business itself took a lot longer to emerge. Before World War II, we didn't need spies. We weren't anywhere. England had India, had Africa. They had all these countries that they had to deal with. The United States was isolationist. And it was only when we became sort of the Cold War empire that, we became smitten with spies and smitten with spy novels.
That's very interesting. I mean, I hadn't really thought of that, but why do you think it took America so long? Because, I mean, you do get the OSS turning into the CIA right after the war, and you have these throughout the 50s. You have these remarkable characters in the CIA. You have Angleton and stories by the dozens. But I haven't really explored what you're talking about. But if really Ludlum was the beginning of it in America, and that was not on the same level that we're talking about of Graham Greene and John le Carré and so forth, what do you attribute that? Because it's one thing to say, yeah, we had a younger spy culture, but you're still talking about decades before quality spy emerges in America.
There were pulp fiction novelists in the 50s and early 60s who used the spy business as their palette. But serious writers taking on the spy business, I really think that started later. And I think it's because we didn't really, as Americans, we were very caught up in the literature of Saul Bellow, of Philip Roth. There was a sort of interiority in our literature that we were still trying to understand ourselves as a civilization. And I think the thing about the spy novel is, I would argue that art imitates life. And the life in our case, the professional spy class, didn't really become a part of our everyday life until the 60s. In the 50s, it was very quiet. And for the most part, that's because, we believed in the Cold War as a place in which we were fighting against a nemesis. Communism was a theological and political enemy. And nobody really questioned what was going on in the spy business. That questioning, which does happen in le Carré's A Spy Came In From the Cold, woke all of us up to the idea that there's this darker side to covert work. There's a dark side to people who spend their time masked and deceiving and sort of suborning. And we all sort of began to think, well, that's actually probably correct. The bubble we're living in, how we look at the world, has got this dark side. The Cold War had its skirmishes, and the spies then became our heroes on in those sort of skirmishes that took place all across the world at that time. And so it is interesting to think about the provenance of the American spy novel versus the English spy novel, and how it right now the spy novel is in the United States is a big and well regarded genre for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but it's interesting to me because it seems to me that maybe what we're talking about is because of the way the serious spy novel reflects the society around it, and human nature. It's not just what le Carré was doing was not just creating a portrait of England in his time. He was creating a portrait of humanity as seen through the lens of a disillusioned world, And I think what's happening there is that England, by the time le Carré, early 60s comes along, is a much more disillusioned place than America. And the idea that not only can you not trust your enemy, but you can't trust your friend, you can't trust your government. So much of what le Carré is about, so much what spy novels are about now, including The Mercenary, is about how, there's not that much difference between your friends and your enemies. And anyone, the closest people to you, can betray you. And it seems to me that in America, we strangely had this faith in our own system. See, that's the thing. I think you need to have a kind of loss of faith in your own people for the spy novel to work, to work on a high level. And that happened to us in the 70s with these,
right,
with the church hearings, and where the depredations of the CIA that had long been kept secret were finally exposed, and with Watergate, where we looked at our government and said, "Holy shit, this is happening." Sorry, I know I'm not being broadcast, but I lapsed into
Well, I
rough
think
vernacular.
you're exactly right, and there's no question that we all, most of the people on this call, I think, grew up in that part of, we left college in the late 60s, 70s, and the church hearings and Watergate really defined us and defined our idea of what government was. And
Even
the
the
heroes of
curdling
that
of the idealism of the 60s,
right, and I think the spy novel became a way of expressing some of that. Although the spy novels went into two ways. There's the thriller, this action-packed, where everything is killing the enemy, and then the other is one that is more sophisticated, which represents, as you suggested, the compromised moral ethos of the characters, and it's and that's certainly, I think, what shaped some of my own thinking. When I think about the characters and what roles they play. In this book, The Mercenary, I just will point out that there are two principal characters, Petrov, who's a Russian, and this guy Garin, who is a sort of murky fellow. He's both Russian and American in a way. And even though they're adversaries, they have much more in common than either of them has with other people in their respective societies, because they're spies. And as spies, they know, they share the fears, they share the doubts, and they come to be somewhat friendly in the course of the book, even though they are adversaries and very cautious of each other. And in some ways, that's a bit like everything in our lives. You sort of are close to people who do the same thing you do. And when you find somebody who is in another country who's ostensibly your enemy, but who you can talk to about these covert issues, which you can't talk to anybody else about, then that person becomes your sort of confidant in a way. And it's one of the interesting twists about spies, is that your enemies are your friends in this weird way. And one of the things that is, is sort of the unwritten rule between spy agencies is that they tend to know who everybody else is on the other side. They follow them, they surveil them, but the unwritten rules, you never take them out. Because once you take out one guy on the other side, then everybody is open season. And so you rarely see spies assassinating other spies. They may get assassinated for other reasons. They may, be moles that are discovered and therefore they're executed. But you rarely saw American spies going after Russian spies or Russian spies going after American spies. It was all more of like, can we get you to come to our side, as opposed to taking you out. And so there's this little world of rules that nobody really talks about or even knows about spy versus spy behavior. And that's one of the things that I was sort of playing with a bit in this particular
quite beautifully. And I think it is one of the most fascinating things. In the Americans, of course, we did that writ large when we had the Jennings on one side of the street, and the FBI guy who was assigned basically to find them and capture them, becoming their best friend on the other side. And so that it was a kind of crazily exaggerated form of exactly what you're saying, but it is true. Yeah, you're all strangely comrades in arms with your enemies. It's kind of what you in a way feel in certain poignant war stories, where you realize that the guy who's shooting at you is your mirror in some way, and very different from the people.
The guys get together in the VFW and talk about the war stories and the time they were in a battalion together and this battle happened. Well, the old spies, and I know this is true, then old Russian spies will gather with old retired American spies, and they will talk about what went on their respective sides in a circumstance. In fact, there's a book where the Russian spy and the American spy collaborated, and they created a let's call it an entire world about this incident, each one bringing their respective understanding of what had been a mysterious event for both sides. But by putting the sides together, they create a holistic explanation for this. And that's, that's one of the things. And the other, and it's sort of what makes them interesting as characters, because they're sort of mysterious, they're dark. Some of the things that they've done, they never will talk about, simply because one, they can't, but they're uncomfortable talking about it. And it's I think one of the things, I haven't written this book, but it's a sort of interesting topic, which is the retired spy. Most of us retire, and some of the people on this call are probably retired. And what you like to do is talk about in retirement your successes, all the things you did in life, and let people give you awards and pat you on the back and say, this was great. We really think you made a contribution to life. Well, spies can't talk about any of that. They're quiet, they're silent, they're in fact muted. And there's one character who, and so the story about a retired spy that, things happen to is, to me, a sort of interesting premise. There's a spy who was very high up in the CIA, dealt with covert operations in Afghanistan and other places. And he runs an antique bookstore in New Hampshire. And it's all sort of special, special books that are hard to find. And it's sort of his way of having this contained little world, which is removed from everything else he did in life, and doesn't talk to anybody, doesn't do interviews, because there's this, he can't. And it's.
But he's sort of dying too, right? I mean, I've had so many.
He's
I've
dying
had so many
to.
experiences presenting something about the Americans, giving a screening or something, and having people come up afterwards who were in the game and who are dying, who are basically saying to me, boy, do I have some stories for you that I can't tell,
Right, exactly. They would love to talk, but they can't talk. And there's a story about William Colby, who is, I think many of you know, he was the director of Central Intelligence, who was fired by Ford. He was there, the one testifying before the church committee. A really decent man, a Catholic, really, in his early career, did some wonderful things, but then got really caught up in the CIA in a bad way, ran the Phoenix program, which killed a lot of Vietnamese, and then was kicked out, basically, and divorced, had issues with his children, and ultimately died either by suicide or accidentally or by murder, and nobody knows. It was on Chesapeake Bay, and his body washed up against the shore, and there are some people saying he was murdered because of the way he, some of the things he did in the agency. But there's one anecdote I remember about him where he had gone back to Moscow after he left the CIA. And he found himself on Red Square. And there was a moment in which he looked behind to see if he was being followed, because that was his experience. Whenever he went to Moscow, he was surveilled. And he realized there was no one there looking to see if he was there. And it was this existential sort of moment where he didn't really know who he was, and everything that had defined him was gone. And the old spy is a particularly sort of interesting character in that regard.
Great poignant moment. It makes me realize that we're galloping along through this session, and we haven't really focused on the Mercenary. And of course, I don't know whether the innate fascination of our conversation that we're both enjoying is selling any books. But I want to say that the reference to Red Square puts me in mind of one thing that I found really remarkable about your book, as someone who's been to Russia to research various projects a couple of times. I don't believe you have, and I was nevertheless very struck by the authenticity of a book that is mostly set in Russia, and and in fact in 1985, and in this circle around the Moscow station and Moscow rules and all that stuff that I thought you really convinced me. In our conversation the other day, I think I mentioned to you something that in storytelling, especially for various screens, TV and movies, you sometimes get to a point where you're saying, how are we going to convince an audience of this? And what you do is you just do the thing convincingly instead of building up the patchwork by which the audience might be convinced. It's convincing because you've done it well and you've put it in front of them, and you've left nothing there for them to say, wait a second. And I feel that you do that in The Mercenary very, very well without actually ever having experienced Russia. The Russianness seeps through. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's when I first decided I was going to set the novel in Moscow, and I usually pick a setting before I pick the characters, just because the setting sort of defines the atmosphere. It defines the reasons people are in a place, which is why you see spy novels in Berlin and London, Moscow, and not in Des Moines, Iowa. It's Moscow. Spies are there for a reason, and so you go to the place where you would find spies. And I had not been to Moscow. I'd hoped to go, but the pandemic hit. And I had to question myself whether I was going to be able to convincingly pull off a novel that's set in Moscow. And I decided that I could, because when you think about a lot of novels, The Red Badge of Courage, for example, it was written by a man who had never been in war. It was not born at the time of the Civil War. And I remember a story about him when a reader came up to him and said, I remember you. You were in my battalion. The scene on page 12, it's exactly as I remember it. And of course, that's the magic that you try and pull off as a writer, that you try and put people into this imaginary place and have it feel convincing. And my approach to doing that is to create characters who are convincing. And then as they move through a place, you see the world through their eyes. And it's that world which is that convinces you. So you have to have enough detail to make it appear authentic, but you're not creating an illustrated version of Moscow. What you're doing is creating characters and the conflicts between characters that then resolve. And so the reader is looking at the world through the characters' actions, conflicts, and behaviors. And if you can come up with convincing characters and add enough, authentic detail, you can. That's the magic of fiction, I think. It's why people get transported endlessly with Jane Eyre. You go back into a world. You're in that world. You are Jane Eyre when you're reading that book. And I think the best writers are able to do that, very convincingly. In my case,
you told me the other day what your great tool was. Do you want to reveal it?
You mean my transportation?
I guess so, yeah.
Okay, so I didn't go to Moscow. I tried, but pandemic hit. So I still wanted to be able to walk down the streets, or have my characters walk down the streets and me know what they would encounter, the street signs, the people. So it so happens that Google Street View which I think you've all used probably, is this remarkable tool that allows you to transport yourself into a city or a place and get enough detail and allow your imagination to sort of explore that world in a way that then you can, for me, I can take it, put it together, sort of mix it up in this sort of chemical reaction in my brain that then comes out as the descriptions. But as with all descriptions, you sort of start a scene with a conflict. If two people are talking in a bar and they're agreeing with each other, it's a pretty dull conversation. And you tend to look away from them and see what the bar is like. But if two people are in a bar arguing, you immediately focus on the argument. You don't focus on the bar. You focus on the argument. And that then creates the milieu in the mind of the reader as to what's going on. And I think that's the one of the things I ended up doing after I left my job was spend 10 years learning the craft of how to tell a story with words. It's not the easiest thing, and you can't just sort of say, oh, I'm going to write a novel. You can, but it's probably not going to be it's not going to be a wonderful novel. Maybe it'll be a good novel for your friends, but it takes a lot of work.
There's also the question of research. I once heard an interview with Peter Morgan, the great creator of The Crown and so many other good works of the Queen. And he was asked by the interviewer, well, so how do you use your research? What do you do? And he said, and it sounded very arch, but it wasn't exactly. He said, I like to do the research after I've written it. And it's an interesting thing. It sounds like he's just being flip, but actually it's true. And I'm sure, as you know, the research can throw you off. And if you start really doing your research and basing your story on your research and on trying to get all the research in, you're going to go astray. Whereas actually what you need is a powerful, strong structure, great characters, a good story, and then supplement it with the research.
Yeah, I tend to, everyone has their own style. My style is to do a lot of research about a place, figure out why characters are there, develop the story, develop the characters, and then go back and do more research and make sure that the world I'm creating is one that it moves people. But everybody has their rules, like the Elmore Leonard rules of writing.
Yeah, I was telling you about that the other day.
I looked them up.
Some of them are really true.
One of the rules is, don't over describe.
Yeah.
Just describe enough.
Yeah.
And I think that's true, because if you over describe, then what you're doing is you're losing the reader. The reader is, it's a travel log. It's not a novel. It's a different thing.
Well, and the other thing, and we were talking about literary spy fiction, if you look at a master like Graham Greene, it's a famously flat style, and it may not be literally terse, but it certainly gives the impression of terseness. And you could say that that's true of many of the best spy novelists. In many ways, I think it's true of your work as well. And I think it's appropriate. I think I was talking to you the other day about The Mercenary and how things go along sort of almost at a flat level, and then there is an eruption, a real eruption, and it takes you by surprise, and it takes you by the throat, and it may be particularly appropriate to this genre where everything is about deception, and everything is about what you see and what you're allowed to see that's behind what you see. And a flat style, a less ornate style, a less revealing style may be more appropriate in that way. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, it's everybody has their own writing style. Graham Greene's is terser, simpler than Le Carré. But I do think that, at least in my own writing, what I find is that, and this is something I got from another writer, was that when the action gets hot, the writing should be cool, because the action has to sort of take you, and the words have to be transparent. And I think that Greene does that very well. He may have deeply fraught emotions in a scene, but the words he's using are cool. They're terse, and the result of that is that it's the reader is doing half the work of creating the scene in their own imagination. And that's not true of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. And Conrad. The discursiveness of their language is one of the wonderful things about it. But I think contemporary English and American literature tends to be more spare and what I'll call just of a cooler nature. And particularly in a spy novel, dramatic stories, that is just more.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure that's an American trait. I mean, like you look at someone like Updike, and to the degree you could consider Nabokov an American, those things certainly wouldn't be true of them. But in terms of spy fiction, I think you're of a class of writers that employs that tool very, very well, and your own descriptions of the hot action are meticulously cool, and I would say the action becomes all the more vivid thereby.
Right, and the other thing that that you end up doing, I'll just answer this, and then Catherine will go to you. But it's important that a novel be well paced. It has to have a rhythm, and that's something you sort of figure out, not so much in the first draft, but in the course of several drafts. You have to take a person along a journey, and it has to be interesting, but you can't have action overwhelm the novel, because you need to breathe. You need to be able to sort of step back from the action and understand the subtleties of the characters. So, figuring out when you're going to murder someone, when someone's going to die, when the bomb goes off, is all part of the mystery of storytelling.
And is that instinctive, or how do you? I mean, I think I said this to you the other day. It almost felt as though your set pieces, your big action moments, as if you had sort of gathered them up and placed them and then filled it in between. I don't know how descriptive that is of your real process, but maybe you can.
Well, it's definitely a process. I think of Hamlet. There's 7 murders in Hamlet. My last novel, The Coldest Warrior, had 7 murders. I consciously made 7 murders, and I scattered them throughout. Polonius is the first to die. He dies about halfway through, and then it accelerates. By the end, it's there are 5 people who die in the last 5 minutes of the play. I think it's it's a thing that you pick up, but mostly by reading. Somebody says, what does it take to be a writer? Well, you have to be a reader. The more you read, the more you understand how other authors have pulled it off, the more able you are to see, how to do it for yourself. And, the first book I wrote, I was very uncomfortable having my character kill another character. And I realized it was Paul Vidich who was having his qualms. And then I said, no, this character has to kill him. It's in his character. It's not me, it's the character. and so so I had him, kill him, and then it was fine.
Well, I think that's a perfect spot for me to jump back in here with some audience questions. And we have a lot from our audience. So you have definitely piqued the audience's interest regarding the history of the spy thriller. One of our audience members mentioned Graham Greene, whom you've already touched on. Seth mentions Upton Sinclair's Lanny Budd novels. Stephen says the US did detective novels instead of spy novels for our disillusionment. Maybe Ross Thomas was the first crossover. Any thoughts on these authors' places in the canon?
Well, I agree. Detective novels were our way of dealing with, that genre of literature for sure. The 30s, some wonderful. I don't know, Stephen. I don't know Ross Thomas. I haven't read his work.
No, but I was actually I was ruminating on that same point that in a way I mean we have a couple things going. The detective novel really was our spy novel and continued to be for a long time, even as our own spy literature emerged. And it goes back, Dashiell Hammett, and it goes way back, and the Continental Op and everything else. But we also had the movies, and we had very genre-oriented movies. So we had the detective movie, and we had the Western, and we were filtering a lot of very important, sociological and historical and even philosophical material through those genres. And so, in a way, the revelation of genre as, big time serious stuff was already emerging in America, and maybe was emerging in America even before it did in some ways overseas. I certainly think that Greene and Le Carre, the kind of 1-2 punch of Greene and Le Carre, did that for the spy novel. But we were already there in America in terms of the seriousness of genre. So those comments are well taken.
Yeah, Dashiell Hammett absolutely filled in for that with the category for sure.
Yeah, Chandler. Yeah, you could go on and on. It's a big. And I learned at Wesleyan from Richard Slotkin.
Absolutely.
The sort of reflection of the Western reflecting off of the gangster genre as well. So there's all that, but yeah.
Well, I do think, England as an empire, which was sort of the end of the empire, where its small country, its tentacles were out to India and other places. It just made sense for the spy novel, which is a thing, sort of the adversarial relationship between countries, as opposed to the United States, where it was the Western and the detective novel were sort of looking into American culture. And American culture was still young at that time. And so it's, I think the novels were an expression of what was going on culturally in both those countries at different
times. Yeah, and also they were, those genres in America were trying to tell the story of America. In a certain way, the Western was trying to tell the story of the expansion of this, unlikely little country into this massive, important, leader of the world. And the gangster movie or the gangster genre, also the hard-boiled novels of people like James M. Cain, and we can list them forever, were really a kind of distorted mirror version of the Horatio Alger story, the American success story that is so American, not English at all, because the English life is all about how you are working within the class system, and American life was about how you made your own damned class system.
Right.
And you get to the top, and money talks, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, we could go on for hours about American genre fiction and so forth. But I do think that all arises before the efflorescence of the American spy novel, as you pointed out earlier.
Right.
We have a question from Andrew for you, Paul, to compare Lemus, not hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Guerin, and Muller and Smiley.
There you go.
This must be Andy Feinstein. So just Alex Lemus is the principal character in Le Carré's A Spy Who Came In From the Cold. The other character, Garen, is my principal character, and Smiley was Le Carré, and Mueller is my character. After I wrote the novel, and of course, Alex Lemus shares the same first name as my character, Alex Garen. And at the time I wrote the book, I didn't make that conscious connection. But after I wrote it and went back to it, and this was about the same time that Le Carré died, I began thinking about, I wrote an article for Crime Reads and began to assemble how he influenced me as a writer. And I began to explore thoughts and feelings that I never really put on a piece of paper. But in doing so, realized that, this book, The Mercenary, in some ways was an unconscious homage to Le Carré. And Alex, the two Alexes, was my way of sort of acknowledging Alex Lemus. They share some similarities. They're both sort of outsiders. They've left either purposefully or not the organization they're working for. They've got qualms about what they do, but they're also pretty dark in their personalities, and in some ways find themselves doing the work they're doing, but without ever having chosen to do it. It became the career they fell into, but they're good at it. So there's definitely, this book in an unconscious way is a homage to Le Carré, who I think is a great writer. And it would be interesting. Stephen, you, I learned, met with him. You interviewed him in a wonderful interview in Vanity Fair, probably 89, 90, something like that.
It was 89, yeah.
And when I was doing my piece, I came across your interview, and it was just a great interview. And I remembered that before you were a screenwriter, you were just a fabulous critic. I would be interested to hear, I guess you spent 2 weeks with him. It'd be interesting to hear just briefly, what he was like as an individual, to have drinks with him, to sort of hear his stories. Yeah. Briefly.
Well, let me preface it by being the pedant who will do the job that someone is probably already like writing down, and just point out that it's Alec Lemus, not Alex. So right. Still the homage exists, but there's that slight difference. Le Carré was incredibly charming. He was very handsome. He was very charming. He was funny. He was articulate. He could do voices, like an actor can do voices. And he could have been anything in life. And yet there was something about him that wished to be furtive. And I think that drove his innate understanding of spying and spy nature. And it all must have gone back to the shame that he felt about his father. And his father was the great secret of his life, because until he wrote his masterpiece, which is called A Perfect Spy, which is essentially about his father, because his father was a con man. Not just like, a guy we say, oh, that guy's such a con man. He was a professional, highly adept con man, life-ruining con man. And that dark secret is what Le Carré grew up with, along with Le Carré had all the gifts of a con man. He could talk anyone into anything. His real name was David Cornwell, but I calling him Le Carré, obviously, for clarity. And he was, he could go to a party and just have the room at his command. And that part of him, he so distrusted and felt that it was so treacherous. And above all, it he felt it would prevent him from working, because he was incredibly prolific, as you know, and Paul, I'm already very impressed with how prolific you are, since you've written 4 novels since 2016, if I'm not mistaken. That's pretty good, and they're good novels. So yeah, but he basically could command a room in any way, but he shut himself up in his beautiful place in Penzance, which is one of the places I visited him, and just became the handmaiden of his work, keeping all this other stuff under a very tight lid.
All right. So we've talked a lot about books this evening, but Marianne has a question about TV. She's a big Americans fan, Stephen. They've also watched and loved Homeland, Fauda, and are about to start The Bureau. What other spy shows do you all watch and recommend?
Oh, well, I was going to go nuts about The Bureau. Like, I think, and I've recommended it highly to Paul too. The Bureau is just great, and and so meticulous in its understanding of this game that Paul and I have been talking about, and also just the inner work. It's based on a sort of fictional subsection of the DGSE, which is the French CIA, but it absolutely convinces you of its authenticity, and it's a smart, brilliantly done show.
There's one that I would recommend. There's 3 seasons, I believe. It's called Berlin Station, which was written by Olin Steinhauer, who is also a novelist, a well-regarded novelist. It ended, abruptly. I wish it had gone on for further seasons. It sort of captured spying in Berlin and the Cold War pretty well.
And Marianne has another question for you, Paul. Many spy novelists follow a central character through several books, but it seems like this is not your current method. She would love to hear you expand a bit on that.
I have a character. I started with George Mueller, and I really liked him. Decided I'd follow him to Cuba, but I also didn't want to be limited by talking about the spy business through the eyes of one character. I was actually more interested in the larger world of spies and the larger CIA. So what I've done is a little bit what Jennifer Egan did with her book, A Visit from the Goon Squad, which was a series of stories. And the major character in the first story becomes a minor character in the second story, and so on and so forth. And she was able to create a much larger cast of characters who tell a larger story by virtue of how she was telling the stories. And so I have Mueller in the 3rd novel as a very small character. In this novel, the 4th novel, he is a co-equal character in some ways, or somewhat subordinate. In the next novel, he's very important, but in a very small way. And that has allowed me to look at the agency and the spy world through a number of other characters, and just gives me a larger palette to work with.
Okay. I'm going to do 2 more questions, I think. We'll go a little bit past 8 as long as everyone is excited and ready to keep going. I think I'm fully invested in this conversation, so I'll stick around. Harold has a very interesting question. Somewhat off track, he says, well, I have 2 experts on the CIA in front of me. I would like to ask if they know how I might find out whether or not my grandfather was in the CIA. He was the US military attaché to Iran during World War II, then returned to Iran in 1951 or 52, ostensibly to teach finance at the University of Tehran. He returned to the US in 1956, which means he was in Tehran through the infamous CIA engineered coup that put the Shah in power. I could never get my father to answer the question, which makes me even more suspicious. Do either one of you know a source I could go to get an answer?
I don't have I mean, the Freedom of Information request might be your best your best source on this. It's, my view is he probably, if not employed by the CIA, was probably associated in some way with the CIA. I had just a small story. I was I'm Slovenian by my father's descent, and I was there for the first time in 1950. And we've gone back many, many times. And 10 years ago, I was at a party with some friends, all relatives, and Bogdan, who's the husband of a second cousin, looked at me and says, "Your father worked for the CIA when you came here in 1950. And I was like 6 months old. And I looked at him and I said, "You're crazy. It's out of the question. My father was a professor, he was a leftist. He did all these things that had nothing to do with what the CIA was all about." But it stuck in my mind. So I began researching it. And he had written a memoir, and there were still some people in Slovenia. The records of the DVB, which is their version of the CIA, are now available. And it turned out that he did go there working for the Voice of America. And it's highly likely that the work product of his visit went to the CIA. So he wasn't working for the CIA, but what he was doing, went to the CIA. And so it feels like your grandfather and my father probably were operating in that same sort of liminal space.
How interesting. Do you think that inspired any of your interest in writing spy novels, Paul?
No, because I only learned this 2 years ago. I mean, less than that. And but in 1950 it wouldn't have been difficult to imagine that, because it wasn't about the CIA then. People didn't really talk about the CIA. What they talked about was communism, anti-communism, and although he should have known something was up, because he was living in London when this thing came through, and his neighbor was the head of the Yugoslav desk at MI6, who put him in touch with the embassy in Belgrade, and Lawrence Durrell and other people who were part of the English community. So, and in fact, in his memoir, he goes on to say that he was concerned, and he didn't keep notes of his conversations. Except at night, he would take out his portable typewriter and type them away, and then, and put them in a place they couldn't be found. So he clearly was conscious that he was doing something that, if revealed, would somehow compromise him. So he and my mother were doing this, and I was dragged along as a 10-month-old, and my 2-year, my brother, who was 3 at the time, and we all have our resentments about our parents. And in my case, it was like, how could you have compromised us as children? You left us with family members we didn't know. You went off for 2 weeks to do this spying. What would have happened if you'd been arrested and we were left as orphans with these relatives who had just, come back from Germany and had been in camps? It's like, come on, would I have done that to my children? No way.
It was a different time.
It was definitely a different time.
All right, a final question from David for both Stephen and Paul. What one or two writers most inspired your approach and why? And a follow-up question for Paul. Agatha Christie wrote 66 books in the mystery genre. Do you have 63 more books in you to make you the best-selling author of all time in the spy genre?
Stephen, why don't you go first, and then I'll... Yeah. I mean, and I think we've really covered the ground about the writers who inspired us, at least along this path. I mean, I've done all sorts of writing in different fields that were not about spying, and I've been inspired by many writers of various sorts. In terms of the spy world, though, for me it's been Green and Le Carre. And that has been but also a lot of nonfiction, but you know, in my other influences, they're sort of the opposite of the spy genre, in a way. I mean, the first movie I wrote was Lolita, and of course Nabokov was a big influence. But on the other hand, no one can write like Nabokov, and no one should try. So so there's that. I'm gonna stop there. I could go on for another couple hours about that.
So Le Carre, Graham Greene, obviously, Joseph Conrad, Eric Ambler. You know, I'd say those are the ones that are sitting on my shelf, which, you know, when I need inspiration, I'll look at them. I've published 4 books. There's a 5th book, which is done. It's with my agent right now. And I'm planning a 6th book. I take one book at a time. And, you know, I would have to be very old to write 63 novels. But, you know, I'm hopeful that I'll continue writing. And it's one of the great pleasures that you can have. And one of the few things you can do is somebody is an art form that you can do in your 60s, 70s, and 80s. I mean, Le Carre published his last book, I think, at the age of 88. So it's you know, for me, it's been a gift for sure.
I want to just say something there, you know, because I've been a writer since shortly after I left Wesleyan, and you know, many friends have come to me over the years and said, you know, I'm thinking of taking up writing. I'm thinking of writing a book. I'm thinking of, you know, writing a movie. I'm thinking of writing this. I'm thinking of writing that. And if you've been a professional writer for a long time, you hear that, and as much as you may esteem those friends, you say, right, okay, good, yeah, great. But when Paul did it, I may have done the same thing. Then he proceeded to knock 4 out of the park, you know, in a row, starting at a you know, fairly advanced age, and I was like, wow, the real thing, boy, okay.
Well, I think, you know, I wanted to be a writer in my 20s, and I never stopped writing. It just that, you know, it's the Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule.
Yeah.
If you do it 3 days a week, I mean, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, every year, it's 9 years before you get to that place. And most people don't have the patience to do something for 9 years before there's a payoff. But I think that's why I call writing a calling. It's something you have to do, and because you must do it, not because you know, you fill in the time doing it. It's but
let me ask you a last question, Paul. You know, we all hear about writers who've been professional writers for a long time saying, "Oh my God, I hate writing," and I've always gone, then why are you doing it? I love writing. How do you feel about that?
It's work, you know. I get up.
There are bad days, yeah.
It's you know, some days it's good, sometimes it's not, but it doesn't really matter, because whatever I write, I'm going to rewrite. And you know, I do the first draft of a book, and it's probably 45 days. I would never show it to anyone. It would be, you know, it'd be an embarrassment. But on the other hand, it's the rough draft that allows you to go to the next draft, and the next draft, and the next draft. And that ultimately, you know, when people say writing is rewriting, you know, that is the truth. You polish and polish. It's a little bit like a sculpture. You start with this piece of stone that has no shape to it, and you imagine it, and then gradually from the stone reveals whatever is in your imagination. And that takes a lot of work. And but that's sort of what, you know, writing a book is. You're sort of revealing the shape of things through, you know, the words you put on the page. But, you know, every sentence can be improved. And so ultimately, you know, I think the people who who are the best writers are sometimes the ones who, care most about words and really find the way to say that one sentence that reveals a character as efficiently as possible.
Yeah.
Well,
I was going to say I was going to just thank. I have the view of things where I can see a lot of the people who I know, and I want to thank you all for joining Stephen and I. Stephen and I have we've done this before, and it's always a pleasure to talk with somebody who's as interested in this genre as I am.
Great pleasure for me too, Paul. Thanks for inviting me. Really happy that we could do this.
Thank you both so much for being with us tonight. Paul, congratulations on The Mercenary. We can't wait to welcome you back for novels 5, 6, and 66. But in the meantime, you can purchase The Mercenary at RJ Julia, Wesleyan RJ Julia, and Bookhampton. Links are in the chat, or come visit us in store. We'd love to see you. And thank you all for being here with us on Zoom tonight.